And that word translated burden is never placed in a title except when the vision is heavy, like a load and full of toil. Here it is used to describe prophetic messages that announced God's judgment. These burdens, even in the book of Isaiah, he uses the word. In the 13th chapter, he uses it when he says, the burden of Babylon. And in chapter 15, he begins by saying the burden of Moab. And these burdens came as a result of the visions God gave his prophets of dreadful events determined for the nations. It was not easy to be a prophet and see what lay in the future without emotionally feeling the burden of the messages. The name Nahum means comfort or comfortable, which is ironic, seeing that there is nothing comforting in his prophecy. This book almost didn't make the canon, for many scholars scorn this book, for it seems to be vengeful, nationalistic expression of Israel's triumph over an enemy. And on par with this, interestingly, there are no readings in the lectionary from the book of Nahum. The capital city of Assyria, Nineveh, isn't mentioned until the 2nd chapter, but its destruction is the theme of this book. In its historical setting, Nahum's prophecy is a prediction and celebration of the fall of Nineveh, which took place in 612 BC. Ancient Assyria was a vast country encompassing portions of 4 modern-day countries in northern Mesopotamia, they being Syria, Turkey, Iran, and Iraq. And Nineveh was its capital city. Nahum is one of those Old Testament minor prophets. And although his work is one describing God's judgment upon Nineveh, this pronouncement comes some 150 years after the prophet Jonah reluctantly went to this city, where he was commanded of God to preach. And as a result of his preaching, Nineveh repented and turned to God. However, it is evident that their allegiance to Jehovah was not permanent. Nineveh apparently had lost its luster and loyalty and love toward God, which now the anger of the Lord is kindled against it, and judgment is certain. Regardless of the translation, when one reads this prophecy, it is very clear that Jehovah has come to his wits' end with Nineveh, and its destruction is nigh. There's no good news, no euangelion, no good news for Nineveh. For the wheels of judgment have already begun to turn, with no reversal possible. But although there is no good news for Nineveh, there is some good news to be found in this book. Using the words of the prophet Isaiah, if there is to be found any beauty for ashes, it is present in our text. For right in the midst of this damning prophecy lies the only hope amid chaos. In our text, we find hope in the midst of corruption and pending confusion. The only light that pierces the blackness of a society's sin is the truth proclaimed in verse 7. The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble, and he knoweth them that trust in him. And to the people of God, those who had an ear to hear, comes this reminder of the inherent and intrinsic character of God. He is good. Now, I come to tell you, this is not a revelation, but it is a reminder of God's true self. This reminder is needed and necessary, for oft times when trouble rise, when calamities prevail, when circumstances careen out of control, and when the shadows of despair cast themselves large, eclipsing the love of God for us in our minds, we need be reminded that God is good.